All right, class. We're going to talk about Gwendolyn Brooks, but I forgot. I want to mention one more thing on Flannery O'Connor. Just a couple of quotes from the Norton, real quick, on the style of her poetry before we jump over to Gwendolyn Brooks here. So back to Flannery O'Connor, real quick. Um, just a couple things. Her writing is weighty with symbolic and religious concerns that are kind of embedded in that black humor. She is considered a regionalist. I forgot to mention that in the last lecture, and she is that kind of new regionalism where she does focus on place, but not just to focus on place. The place is used to prove a point. Like, for instance, this isolated dirt road. This all about the selfishness of the grandmother, and a good man is hard to find. Is that's dead end dirt road is what leads to her death, or the whole family's death, and it's symbolic of that selfishness. That rural place is all tied up in their despicableness and the racism. Anyways, uh, typically, this is a good quote here. Typically, a Flannery O'Connor story consists at its most vital level of in people talking, clucking their endless reiterations of cliches about life, death, and the universe. These cliches are captured with beautiful accuracy by an artist who had spent her life listening to them, lovingly and maliciously keeping track until she could put them to use. Early in her life, she hoped to be a cartoonist, and there is a cartoon like mastery in her vivid rendering of character through speech and other gesture. Critics have called her a maker of grotesque, a label that, like other ones, regionalist Southern ladies or Roman Catholic novelists, might have been annoyed with. She once remarked tartly that anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader, unless it is grotesque, in which case it's going to be called realistic. I just thought that was a fun little quote that you guys might like. Her stories are often filled. I don't know if I, mentioned this earlier, but with religious allusions and parodies. But when I say that she has these religious elements and these spiritual elements, she does it without being preachy. I kind of like how she does it because she's like, you can tell like that she's a person of faith, but she's not trying to force that faith on other people. She's not trying to be preachy, where it's like, all you sinners or all you people who don't believe are going to die. It's like, no, the people who are awful people are the people who are going to suffer in these stories. And the people who are good people are the ones who are often rewarded in these stories. Uh, anyways, but back to Gwendolyn Brooks, though. Let's talk about her because she's like really, really good poet. Gwendolyn Brooks, I guess Gwendolyn Brooks is like two poets because what happened with her is she kind of, if you remember throughout the semester, we were talking about there was in the Harlem Renaissance, there was a very conscious idea of um, how African American writers should write for their audience, or to what degree should they think about who their audience was, being that their audience was largely white. And so, for the first half of Gwendolyn Brooks's career, she uses like very formal structures. By formal structures, I mean things like sonnets and lyrics, lyrical ballads, stuff like that, that has rhyme scheme and has been used very traditionally for a while. Um, at the beginning of like the Harlem Renaissance, she's publishing with a New York publisher, and most part of her audience is largely white. She is, uh, you know, uh, her poems typically portray uh, the waste and loss that comes from what I guess like Langston Hughes' poem that we looked at, "A Dream Deferred." What racism and stuff in America, what that does, what kind of loss and alienation and idea of otherness that creates in poets. And so she grows up in Chicago, and she writes a book called A Street in Bronzeville. Bronzeville is what I guess was the derogatory term for the black part of town. And So at the beginning of her career, like Langston Hughes and like a lot of these other poets we looked at, she focuses on very ordinary aspects of African American life. She has character sketches that stress the vitality and often subversive morality of. This is from the Norton, by the way, quote unquote. In her poetry, her character sketches, she stressed the vitality and often subversive morality of ghetto figures, good girls who want to be bad, the boredom of children of hardworking, pious mothers, the laments of black mothers and women abandoned by their men. Brooks's diction was a combination of florid biblical speech of black Protestant preachers, street talk, and the main speech patterns of English and American verse. She wrote vigorous, strongly accented, strongly rhymed lines with a great deal of alliteration, and she cultivated traditional lyric forms. For example, she was one of the few modern poets to write extensively in the sonnet form. Okay, so then this happens. So then she goes to this writing conference. I think it was called the Second Black Writers Conference at, I think, Fisk University, but it's in 1967. And when she does this, she meets all these new and upcoming young black poets who are very militant, and they've gotten a little bit tired of being of waiting patiently for equality and be treated equally. So they've gone the more militant route in politics, the more Malcolm X route, rather than the more Martin Luther King route. And so her poetry automatically changes at this point. She drops her publisher in New York and goes with an all black publisher in Chicago, and a black owned publishing uh, outfit in Chicago. And then she just starts writing just for her primary audience shifts to being African American audiences, and she gets kind of tied in politically with some of these more militant groups, including having workshops out. You know, she has like some workshops, like outreach workshops for the public, and she starts trying to pull in some gangs and teenage gang members, and kind of get them away from that and involved in poetry, and that influenced her poetry as well, as you'll see in a second. And she becomes a little bit more involved in her kind of role as being not only an African American leader but a feminist leader, and and her subject matter, the focus and her technique and her subject matter starts to change. It starts to get more political. Starts to deal with questioning the idea of revolutionary violence and ideas of the African American identity. Her style also starts evolving out of the concentrated imagery and narratives of that earlier writing, and starts getting away from that formal diction and more into kind of an energetic, improvisatory type, mix of like African American chants and emphatically spoken language and jazz improvisation and stuff like that. That was a lot of influence in literature in the '60s. You had this idea of getting back to tribal identity and stuff like that, and jazz and blues and all this stuff is really starting to influence poetry a lot because of Langston Hughes as well. But anyways, you can see this in her poems. If you look at like these early poems like Kitchenette Building, you can see how formal and tight they are and how they deal with that earlier style. And then you can see they start to get a little bit more free form as the style goes on, and they start to get a little bit more like this one. You know, if you listen to the audio in this one, you see it gets a little bit more like jazz and starts to change as we go on throughout her styles. But I hope that is helpful.